On the phone, it is a pleasure to welcome back to the program New York Magazine staff writer Eric Levitz. Eric, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So, Eric, you had a piece just a couple of days ago, I guess. The GOP is making its contempt for democracy clear. Will the mainstream media? I think we all know the answer to this, but let's talk about specifically what you're talking about, because I just went through my diatribe of, and Ezra Klein, more or less, I think, entered into the sort of center left world of punditry and reporting. He's a reporter. I am not really in any way, but around the same time. Back in the early aughts. And he wrote a piece about, as you know, Paul Ryan being a con man. And for me, it's a lot less interesting that Paul Ryan's a con man. In the piece himself, he said that we got fair warning from a New York Times columnist about this, who was fairly prominent at the time, that Paul Ryan was a con man. But why this happens? And you've written a piece about the failure of the mainstream media to notice the Republican Party's repeated examples of not giving a shit about democracy. Just lay out those examples.
Sure. So the jumping off point for the piece was the events in North Carolina's now 9th House District, where, in North Carolina, the Republican Party has pushed voter ID laws very strongly, had really sounded the alarm about the threat that voter fraud poses to American elections, and they were obviously not alone in doing that. The GOP, since at least the second Bush administration, when they launched a 5-year Justice Department investigation into voter fraud and ultimately produced no evidence, but nevertheless persisted in pushing the idea that restrictions on voting were desperately required to avert this phantom threat, has really been committed to the idea that, look, even if there's like a 1% chance that our elections are going to be tainted by fake votes, then or people voting who aren't allowed to vote, perhaps because they're African American and were subjected to abusive policing and then got into the criminal justice system, and then we decided to disenfranchise them for that. But that aside, that this is such a terrible thing that if we need to disenfranchise poor voters who don't have driver's licenses, that's just the price that we need to pay. If we need to prosecute immigrants who are here legally but aren't yet qualified to vote and they didn't quite realize that and they cast a ballot that they shouldn't have, we need to put them in prison for 8 years, as prosecutors have been doing, because it's just the integrity of our elections is just that darn important. And then we have in North Carolina's 9th House District a Republican candidate hiring a convicted fraudster to essentially run a completely fraudulent absentee ballot operation, where he hired people to go around this county, Bladen County, North Carolina, and collect absentee ballots, bring them to him, and the ones that he liked, he would file. The ones that he didn't, he would destroy.
Now, Eric, hold on. To be fair, who better to pick up fraudulent ballots than a fraudster?
No, I don't fault the hiring decisions that were made, just the general ethical orientation of the operation.
Right.
But so this happens. There's overwhelming evidence, not just evidence that this scheme possibly cost the Democrat the general election, but that actually the incumbent Republican congressman was a victim of this same scheme in the Republican primary and probably lost his seat to it. So a Republican was victimized by this fraud. But the overall upshot of everything was that the Republican was going to hold that House seat in a swing district. And so initially, the North Carolina GOP, the party that was all about protecting the integrity of our elections, decided that, you know what, actually, well, preventing voter fraud is, on the one hand, worth disenfranchising black voters to prevent. Ensuring that a House election isn't stolen amidst overwhelming evidence, is not worth waiting a couple of weeks to finish the investigation. They called for the Board of Elections to immediately certify the results. They sent out donor calls that tried to raise money off the idea that Democrats were illegitimately trying to steal the election by insisting on an investigation into the evidence of election fraud. And they also, alternatively, some others began using it as an excuse to push for even stricter, less access to the ballot, to cut down on mail-in voting, because look, see, it's such a huge liability in our system. Meanwhile, in the legislature, North Carolina Republicans put forward a bill that, totally neutral, fair rule that's just stipulated that the party in the state that has the second most registered members, that party should control all of the county election boards in even-numbered years, and then the party with the most members should control it in odd-numbered years. And then this way it's split and it's fair, which in North Carolina, Republicans have the second most number of members and apparently anticipate that they aren't going to grow their party, and so are legislating that in every year where there's an election, all of the election boards need to be controlled by us, which, right now, those election boards are the one thing standing between them and stealing this House race. So since I wrote the piece, North Carolina Republicans have realized that their situation is untenable and have started to gesture towards being possibly open to a make-up election. But nonetheless, that's what they've been doing. And so my argument is, like, if you have something this blatant here, up to this point, the mainstream media, whenever covering this issue, has always made a point of, acting as though we need to, give the benefit of the doubt,
right,
that Republicans have this legitimate concern, and every story has at least one quote from them saying that, in the face of a blatant admission of bad faith, this clear, is the mainstream media going to, accept that no, actually, you know what, there is only one major party that is even facially, even superficially committed to democratic governance, and the other one isn't, and that's like a pretty important thing for the fourth estate to be able to communicate to voters. And thus far, that has not been the case, despite not only events in North Carolina, but also the power grab in Wisconsin and Michigan, et cetera.
I want to talk about that in a moment, but just I want to remind people too that not only was the Bush administration up to a 5-year investigation where they found, I think, literally nothing. There were multiple U.S. attorneys who were fired because they were not coming in with prosecutions. I mean, there was 3 or 4. This became a big scandal. That the U.S. attorneys are getting pressured by Karl Rove to bring some of those voter ID cases because they needed some justification to pass this legislation. And when we talk about what happened in Wisconsin, there's and what's happening in Michigan. I mean, first off, we had years ago indication of this when in Michigan they passed the city manager rule, right? The failure of democracy, which led, you could draw a straight line, frankly, to the poisoning of children in Flint by the water because of that. But just remind us of the New York Times headlines that followed this Wisconsin thing. Yesterday, we played Chuck Todd's interview with Evers, the new governor. I mean, just stunning stuff here.
Yeah, no, Todd came after my article and really then validated my pessimism even more than the Times did. But the Times wrote a couple stories about it. One of them infamously, I think they changed the headline, but was headlined "Wisconsin Republicans defiantly, quote, stand like bedrock in the face of Democratic wins." My point was that both of their articles on the fight in Wisconsin did not ever. You're covering this dispute, this contest of who is legitimately has a claim to wield power, the legislature or the executive branch of the government. And in neither of these articles was there even a moment observing that the statewide officers, the incoming governor and attorney general, were elected with the plurality of the vote, were democratically elected, where the state legislature was not, where it's controlled by a party that actually received fewer votes for the assembly and fewer votes statewide than the other party, and yet the party that does not actually have any popular, the branch of government that does not have a popular mandate for its majority is taking powers away from the branch that does. And again, Republicans themselves are not actually all that deceitful about this. The Wisconsin Assembly Speaker Robin Vos stated explicitly that he told reporters, we would have a majority if it wasn't for Madison and Milwaukee. If you just don't count all the people who live in those cities, then we would have a majority, and so therefore we should govern the state. They're quite explicit that actually, people who don't vote for us really shouldn't have voting rights or say over the government. But that is not emphasized in the mainstream media's reporting on it.
It's not even mentioned. I mean, it's not even mentioned. And I just want to be explicit about this. The Republicans got like 46% of the vote, I think, in Wisconsin, and they have, 54% of the power in the House, or more, actually. It's a veto proof. This one's even more egregious. I'm getting confused with the states. They had under 50% of the vote and something like 65% of the power in the state house. That's just...
Democrats have 36 of 99 assembly seats.
That's just nuts. It's just nuts. And Chuck Todd just talks like Evers should really be more apologetic to Scott Walker, and maybe Scott Walker will be okay with letting him have some of the authority that Scott Walker had as governor. So, all right, so we have so many examples of this. What's the problem?
I think the problem, I think there are a variety of answers, but I think one basic one is that the mainstream media as it exists today developed in a less polarized political era and around a business model that was about achieving scale by being able to sell newspapers, broadcast news to Democrats and Republicans alike, and doing that requires internalizing an idea of this fundamentally, both presenting a kind of equality of legitimacy between the two parties, regardless of what they do and do not stand for, and also, sort of implicitly downplaying the stakes of political conflict. That model was deeply problematic from the beginning, but it's considerably more so when you have one major party that is not committed to the norms of liberal democracy, and yet the media isn't really adjusting to this. There's so many. It's both. I think there are both business concerns at this point, but also just ideological ones. At this point, the New York Times, I think, from an economic perspective, its subscriber base is overwhelmingly liberals. I don't think it has a real economic incentive to downplay Republican extremism. I think that it's ideological. It's so baked into the norms of that institution that it's kind of reflexive.
Okay, so it's really just muscle memory that they can't. I mean, and we should be clear here, right? Like, this comes from the ownership, and they simply hire people who are inclined to have this disposition, less or maybe not for economic. Who knows what's in the heart or minds of another person, but their career is built on that same sort of like brand. Like, I take both sides seriously, regardless of any evidence that may be out there to suggest that one of these may not be a good faith actor.
Yeah, I think there is also the need to preserve access to sources in both camps, as far as just it is, I guess, a legitimate practical necessity if you're going to do reporting on negotiations in Congress and being able to get, word of where it's heading to the public before it becomes common knowledge, then you do need to have Republican staffers who are willing to talk to you. And if your paper describes in forthright terms what the Republican Party is today, maybe that's not possible. I don't know. I could think of excuses, but regardless, it comes with significant costs.
So, what is there? Is this the way it's going to be? Like, like I say, this is, I feel like I have been, more or less fighting this fight as consistently as anything else that I've done over the past 15 years. 14, 15 years ago, we shut down the phone banks at the New York Times Washington Bureau because of Adam Nagorny on the radio. And I don't know what Adam Nagorny is doing these days, but aside from that, it didn't seem to have much impact.
Yeah, well, I think the media environment is really different. You mentioned the Ezra Klein piece. There was also a piece by Matthew Iglesias earlier this week that basically argued that the threat to democracy is actually not populism, but is the GOP establishment and its highly legalistic methods for undermining popular sovereignty, which was sort of an endorsement of arguments made by people like Corey Robin and Jedediah Purdy, people identified with the at least quasi-radical left in the United States. And so I think orthodoxy within the liberal opinion media has really internalized the extremism of the GOP, and that form of media is a lot more prevalent, than when the Majority Report began. So I think that there's movement in that sense, and I think that it's, there's never going to be an equivalence between the sheer hackishness of each side's infotainment propaganda apparatuses, because there is just a certain amount of intellectual integrity that liberals tend to have more of than conservatives. But I think that Pod Save America is kind of a quasi Limbaugh for the left, and it is its attitude towards Republicans, even though it is establishment Obama staffers, it's a considerably more more sweeping critique than what we've seen previously. And so there has been movement, I think, in how the average Democratic voter is being told to think about politics by their media, and I think that that's potentially significant.
Yeah, I think that's true. I would agree with that, and I think your point about that integrity, it also strikes me as the structural disadvantage in this playing field, and maybe it's a disadvantage. It may be for the benefit of all of us, is that compensation in the in this arena for the left and right is different. On the right, it's cash. It's literally bucket loads of cash. On the left, there is a certain amount of I'm esteemed by those in this arena. I feel like that has more cachet on the left than it does on the right, and part of that I think it may be because of the sort of like academic roots and value system that seem to be more present on the left.
Yeah, I think that there's obviously there are opportunities to sell out in democratic politics, but that generally doesn't take the form of jobs in media, more in consulting.
Right.
Working for the Podesta Group or whatever. But yeah, and even then, I don't think the money does. Did you see like Nick Ayers, like Pence's right-hand man?
Yeah.
He's like $54 million is his net worth apparently somehow. So yeah,
Has anybody?
I mean, we're all making a
ideas?
terrible mistake.
Has
doing what
anybody
we
made
do.
a like? Has anybody sort of figure out what that's about? Where's that guy getting that kind of money?
Yeah, I have no idea.
He's like
I don't
35, right?
I mean, I don't know. There's got to be bodies buried somewhere, but I don't know.
That's unbelievable. That's unbelievable. I was just going to do an ad for the dictator that we're promoting from a former Soviet republic.